Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Laura Beadling. I'm an English professor here at YSU, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about adapting historical trauma as it applies to Ashes in the Snow and Between Shades of Gray. So thinking about adaptation is a huge subject for discussion. And it's one that almost everybody has opinions about because we all have read books that have been made into movies. So rather than presenting answers, this talk is meant to give you food for your own thoughts about this adaptation in particular, as well as maybe some other adaptations you are familiar with as well. Adapting novels into films always has proponents and detractors. Films do tend to have wider audiences than novels, which makes that attractive, especially for a novel like this that has at its heart some history that has been largely suppressed or forgotten. And so part of what motivated the author to write the novel in the first place was a desire to tell that history that has not gotten its due. So it is easy to see why films with their wider audiences and more accessibility would be appealing to an author with that sort of motivation. Film also has a range of tools to use that novels don't, right? Novels work with words on pages, and that's more or less typically it. Films, on the other hand, have music, right? Have color, have composition. They have actors embodying these characters and bringing out other aspects through their bodily performance of the character. But books portray characters' inner worlds and experiences in a very direct way that's hard to replicate in any other medium. So a film can never be a book, nor vice versa, right? They're different media with different tools and possibilities. And that's one of the things that I want to kind of talk about today in terms of this book and its adaptation. So one of the most basic questions I think we can ask about a narrative is, who is the main character? So in the book, it's pretty clearly Lena's story. It's from her point of view. If Lena doesn't know it, we don't know it. If Lena's not there to see something, she then has to rely on somebody else to tell her about something that happened without her presence. If she doesn't know it, if she doesn't hear about it, if she's not there, we don't know about it. So the book is very intimately tied to her experiences, her thoughts, her feelings, and what she sees and does. And so we're limited in that way to her, but it's also a very powerful connection that we have with that character. Right from literally the first sentence of the book, right, we are allied with Lena's experiences. The very first sentence, right, they took me in my nightgown. And think about all that is packed into that sentence, right? That there is a force, right, that has taken her. And not only that, but in her nightgown, right, which is a very sort of private kind of garment. And that gives us that sense of her vulnerability and the forces that are arrayed against her from her own viewpoint, right from the word go. So her experiences and thoughts are primary. Her art, right, and the artist that she idolizes, her memories, right, her hopes, her plans, her trying to communicate with her father, her learning to deal with things. All of that is really what the book takes as its subject matter. The film certainly takes Lena as a very important character. We still see, she's still pretty much the only character that gets flashbacks, right? We see the past from her point of view. But it is able to take on multiple perspectives. So unlike the book, in the movie, we see several scenes that Lena is just not part of at all, right? And in particular, one of the changes between the two versions of the narrative that I found personally really interesting was that the film took on Nikolai Kretsky as a pretty major character. He's certainly in the book, right? But not to the depth, not to the level that he is in the film. Where in the film we hear about his past, his family, we see him sort of develop and change over the course of the novel in a way that we really don't necessarily see in the book, right? So there are quite a few scenes with him as the center that Lena doesn't take part in quite a few of those, and yet we still have access to them because the film takes a broader perspective, whereas the book is mostly concerned with what happens to Lena. His point of view is much more detailed, right? We hear about a little bit about his past, about his family, about what has happened to him, and we see him suffer at the hands of the commander in much more detail than we get in the book version, right? In some ways, and this might be controversial, I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about this. In some ways, he has more of a character arc than Lena, right? At least in the film I'm talking about, right? From the very beginning, his character gets several close-ups, which is a film's way to signal us that this character is going to be significant. So as soon as he is introduced, he gets a number of pretty long close-ups on him. He's conflicted, right? When Elena asks him for help, he says, "I'm not allowed." He doesn't scream at her or hit her. He says, "I'm not allowed," which right from his first bits of dialogue indicates that he is not exactly a free agent, right? And that point is brought up even more forcefully a little further on in the film, where he tells Elena, right, "You're wearing your rags, I'm wearing this uniform, but neither of us are doing it by choice," right? So his status is much more sort of complicated. Yes, he has power in the film, but it is mitigated, right? And we see him suffer from the commander and from his place, which is different from the other soldiers, right? So he's conflicted, but he is helpful early on, right? He allows Jonas to stay with the family. He gives Elena some additional ration coupons, etc. And then we see the terrible moment, several terrible moments, right, where he is forced by the commander to shoot Ona, right, which he has a big reaction to. He has to shoot, or no, I'm sorry, he doesn't shoot Ona, he shoots the old woman who is stealing food. And we see the toll that takes on him. We go with him and see him vomit in reaction to what he was forced to do. Yeah, and then we also see his conflicts with the other soldiers who sort of taunt him, and when he physically fights back, the commander approves of that. So by taking out his anger in a very direct physical way, he gets sort of rewarded for that action by the commander. The commander agrees to transfer him into his own command and gives him that opportunity, but it's also quite a terrible place. And by making Kretsky very directly responsible for prisoners, he can no longer say, "Well, I was following orders," right? The commander, when he gives Kretsky his own command, sort of also gives him that responsibility. So when he takes command, that also takes a toll on him. And we see that he has sort of come full circle when he orders another young soldier to shoot yet another disobedient woman. And he does so. But then at the very end, he repents, right? He takes some good action to the extent that he can, and then he atones in the only way that's really open to him at that point, really. So if you think about which character changes the most, which character develops the most on screen, I think it would have to be Kretsky, right? He has a full character arc that really takes us some distance from who he is at the beginning of the film to who he is at the end of the film. Whereas Lena, I don't think changes as much. Perhaps she's a very strong, well-drawn character right from the word go. She has less to develop. I don't know. But I think there's an argument to be made there that this might even be a dual narrative in the film version because Kretsky takes on such an important role. Again, that might be a little controversial, but it's something for you to think about, is how do we know who the main character is? What makes a main character a main character? And if character arc is one of the things that makes a main character, then I think we got to think about Kretsky in that role. One of the interesting aspects about adapting a book with such suffering at its heart is really how do you portray that, right? So books can get quite descriptive in terms of what the character goes through. So in Lena's case, right, she suffers on the train, right, right from the word go. It's 6 weeks in a car in the darkness. It's described as very physically uncomfortable, lack of privacy, lack of food, lack of warmth, all of this sort of stuff. While on the train and then right after that, she has to witness Ona's suffering, which is very well described in the book, from Ona giving birth to the baby's trouble feeding, to its death, to Ona's separation from the baby, and then Ona's death, right? All of which Lena has to watch in very close proximity. We hear a lot in the book about Lena's experiences of the work camp, of the forced labor that she is forced to do, digging the holes until her hands run with blisters, right? Climbing into the hole and then being sort of psychologically tortured by the commander, right? Just the cold, her ever-present hunger, the uncertainty of what's going to happen to them, if they're ever going to see their father again. Yeah, all of that sort of uncertainty is very psychological, and it's easy for a book to get into Lena's point of view and tell us all about these things that she's suffering. The film doesn't have those same tools, and it can visually depict, but it's a little bit harder to show that kind of suffering. Watching her brother physically suffer, learning about Andreas's mother and her mistaken thoughts about what's going on there, is all things that the book describes in quite a bit of detail, right? Just think about, as one example, Jonah's scurvy, right? When Lena's first told about it, she's not allowed to leave work, so she is forced to worry and still, but still has to work. And nobody knows what the illness is, right? They know that they don't have any medicine to treat him. They don't know for a fact at first whether or not it's contagious, and maybe they're in danger. The woman whose shelter they're sharing wants to kick them out because she's afraid of getting whatever it is that Jonah has to sort of add to their torment. Jonah's body is described in pretty stark terms, right? He's got spots on his skin, on his gums that are sort of purple and bleeding. He's very weak. Lena has to give up her own rations, and it's not like she exactly has a lot. She has to beg others for help. I mean, all of this is various forms of suffering just in this one instance in the book. And the whole book, since it's so closely allied with her point of view, really describes that suffering. But this is Jonah's scurvy is entirely omitted in the film. Watching violence and trauma is different than reading about it, especially with children, right? Jonas becomes, in my view at least, a fairly minor character in the film. And some of the things that he does are just not shown in the film. And in fact, most of the suffering depicted in the film is of adults. So Kretsky's attempted assault of Elena, the shooting of the various women, there are at least 3 women that are shot on screen pretty horrifically, the illness and lingering illness and death of Elena, and then the toll that some of these things take on Kretsky at various points. So while that is omitted in the film, there's a lot that's added to the film that makes Lena more overtly defiant. Her portrait of the commander, in the book she complies, and it's a quite terrible scene as she tries to make herself draw a flattering portrait. But in the film, she sort of depicts him as she sees him, as a monster, and then in retribution, her drawings and other materials are burned. At the very end, her demands for rations, warm clothing, and medicine, she makes very clear demands on Kretsky, and he does what he can and then kills himself, right? So I'm curious as to which version of Lena, it says Linda, it meant to say Lena, do you find most compelling, right? And in terms of story interest, which do you find more realistic? And these are 2 different portraits of what it means to be strong. Which version of Lena do you find strongest? So I want to end with a couple discussion questions to fuel your own thoughts about the book and the movie. In which version does Lena's art play a more important role? In the movie, you were allowed to actually see her drawings, but I think in some ways they play a bigger role in the book's narrative, right? Both film and movie include Lena's acceptance into the art program, but they put it in very different places in different ways. What do you think? What do you think that those differences change about the narrative? What does the story that Andreas tells on the train about Ruta and Sepetys, in which we hear again at the end of the film, add to the narrative? It's not really in the book very much, but it's a fairly large part of the film. Why did they add it? What's the effect? I think both versions have different kinds of hope that appears in different places and in different ways. Where do you see hope in the book and in the film, and how are they different? And then finally, why do you think the film eliminated Andreas's mother as a character? And what effect do you think this has on the movie as a whole? So just some questions for you to think about. Thanks so much for your attention.